Hey everybody, welcome back to Oslo. Today's episode is slightly different from the first two ones, since at last I'll be not just building roads, but I'll be also building buildings aside from building roads, since finally we're getting into the city center. And today I'm more or less finishing the city center. There are still some parts that are slightly unfinished or rough around the edges, not to mention that I will get into some assets that I've received from the guys who've asked me to do this kind of thing. So at some point hopefully there should be a few buildings from real life Oslo popping up here, but for now it's just going to be the basic visuals, the basic road layout and buildings and everything of the city center. And what my most important goal and challenge is to try and take some of the in-game assets and a few assets from the workshop and try to compose them in such a way that this at least looks kind of like Oslo, without delving too deep into mods and assets and anything that can leg up the game too much. So without further ado, let's get into the time-lapse. So for my first thing, well, technically it's not really my first thing, because just before I started this recording I actually forgot to save my earlier build, so I closed the game after like 2 hours of work, and then I didn't save it at all before opening it again, so I was kind of ashamed. But the pro of like doing it again is that I kind of know what I want to do and what I'm doing. So everything was a little bit easier this time around, and what I wanted to do is work on this whole Oslo City district right next to the station. This is really one of the most dense parts of Oslo and has a lot of very recognizable modern architecture, especially this curve around here. But my major challenge here is to try and make something that has buildings with similar shape and mass of the real buildings, to try and make this recognizable despite not having access to really any of the assets that I should have to do this kind of thing. So the two taller buildings that you can see kind of in the corner over here is what makes for the very signature site of Oslo City, which is a shopping mall around here. And the buildings, I've tried to kind of pick some buildings with a similar shape and size of the real life situation and plop them in a very similar composition to kind of make it look recognizable. And I think in the end it's just a very sort of familiar site, but not one that looks exactly the way that it does in real life. I'll try to get some pictures so you can kind of get a bit of an idea of what this thing looks like in real life. This is basically it. So it's similar enough, I suppose, but it's really one of the biggest challenges. But it's one of those little spaces that I decided to add a little bit more detail, just to make sure that the city still looks like Oslo, because none of the buildings are actually going to look like buildings of Oslo. So there were a few parts where I wanted to put in some extra effort to at least make it familiar and kind of recognizable what that sort of area is. But most of this will look very different. And honestly, this is why in the last episode I really said to curb your expectations, because this is not gonna look like real life Oslo at all. It's just gonna be an as believable copy as you can get in City Skylines, with not a lot of assets and with a lot of still in-game stuff. But yeah, when you get close to it on a building level, it's not gonna look quite the same. So I think in the end, what my goal with the city is to make the city functionally somewhat the same as Oslo and make it recognizably Oslo from an aerial perspective. But when it comes to ground level experience, it's not really that important, and it's not going to be quite that much like Oslo, maybe say for a few spaces that are just too much of a signature part of the city to not include that kind of thing, which this station area is one of. And it's also a really great time again to delve into putting all kinds of buildings inside each other, kind of like I did with Amar City, since all of these buildings are quite large and quite complicated and have honestly actually kind of grown throughout the ages. There's lots of different time periods present here, and because of that you get these huge clusters of buildings, which the only real solution to that issue is just to put a bunch of buildings in each other until you get something which looks more or less like the real life situation. So that's what I'm kind of doing with the station. One of my biggest mistakes actually at the time is that I still thought that Oslo Station was a terminus station, which it more or less is, and if you look at a map, it definitely is, but there's actually some underground lines continuing, so that's something which I'll definitely get into later. Shouldn't be a worry at the moment. At the moment, the in-game one is still a terminus, but I'll get to some of the train tracks that end up at the other side of the city eventually as well. Now, this is a very interesting part because it is probably the most recognizable and most photographed part of Oslo. It's an area called the Barcode, since it's a bunch of modern buildings that are arranged in such a way that they kind of look like a barcode. I think it's pretty cheesy, but pretty cool idea at the same time. It's really one of the most recognizable parts of Oslo, even if apparently it doesn't have a lot of it doesn't have a lot of appreciation from the people who live in Oslo. I think especially in the years after it was recently built, there were some polls held and the majority of people in the city didn't quite like the whole modern look of it, which is very different from the rest of Oslo, to be honest. But it's still a signature part of the city, especially if you look at the city from the water. So an important thing to include, and since there aren't any exact copies of the Barcode buildings, I went on a bit of a hunt for tall, slender, modern buildings in the workshop and tried to arrange them in such a way that it kind of resembles the Barcode project. Obviously, none of the buildings really have the same look, but for me personally, it's actually one of the things which I'm the happiest with how it came out. Even if it doesn't look entirely like the real project, it kind of gets there and it's definitely recognizably the Barcode area. And yeah, that was all fun and games, but then I had to get to placing keys to map out the edges of the waterfront here. And this turned out to be a lot more time consuming than I expected beforehand. I even had to end up doing some stuff off camera, and even as I am speaking right now, I still haven't gotten this area down perfectly because the keys were just so damn annoying. It's really hard to get these things in and make sure that you don't have them clipping anywhere, make sure that you get these edges as straight as possible while at the same time following that real life layout. But what was the most frustrating part about this is that with a key, you always have this inside part and an outside part, and supposedly the inside should just be completely straight and perfectly align with ground level, and then the outside should just go down underwater and you have no weird terraforming bits and bobs here and there. But what happened a lot of times is that I got the inside outside, so I would get these little pits on the inside of the key while there'd still be terraforming stuck on the outside of the key wall in the water, and similar things like that. So yeah, this turned out to be kind of annoying and a major challenge to try and get right. At the moment you might notice that the key isn't exactly correct, since there is supposed to be an area where it's much more narrow on that one main pier that sticks out, which is right next to the Opera House. But I'll get back to that at some point in the future. At this point I just kind of wanted to get this thing over with and move back into the rest of the city, which, to be very fair, I thought was a more important and interesting thing to start working on at this point in time. So I'm just kind of finishing these key walls around here. This is going to be part of the port as well. Speaking of which, I'm glad that Oslo doesn't have that much of a port, even if for Norway it is quite large, since that would have been really challenging to do. But aside from a few waterfront areas, there's not too much to do in terms of creating a harbor, so that's quite nice. There are these very recognizable and sort of part of an international trend areas where a part which used to be port at some point in the past has now been redeveloped and is still in redevelopment to be a residential and office area. The Barcode area is one of those things. I believe it used to be part of the port proper as well. And the same goes for this over here. So currently there are some newly built housing developments over here, and that shouldn't be too difficult to get right, but it's just one of those things where I'm glad at least that I have to build some housing developments rather than building some kind of shipping container or anything like that area. Now for now I am just gonna work on this road connecting Oslo to the south of the city for a little bit, but after this I figured it was finally time to head back to the Quays and try fixing the shape, and as you can see this is where everything kinda goes south. I tried to just do one simple thing and it ended up being a domino of all the keys turning inside out and having the terraforming messed up in one way or another. If anybody knows any trick to getting these keys to work perfectly, that would be super appreciated. I was thinking for a long time to just download assets and have roads around these areas and just place assets that kind of force a waterfront, very much the way that I did it in most of Oslo City. For one, because I think it's easier to do, but I also think it looks a little bit better. You end up with not these weird curvy bits on the edges, but rather some proper square edges. And it's also something that looks a little bit nicer, I think. But in this case, I wanted to try and not do that kind of thing, since there'd be no way that I could have roads everywhere. And also I wanted to not use assets that I wouldn't absolutely need. And I didn't think it was really necessary to download a bunch of waterfront assets just to make that look slightly better. So I ended up choosing to just go with the in-game keys and try to use the thing that you're actually supposed to use for this kind of thing. But it ended up being quite difficult, as you can see. So yeah, that was a little bit frustrating. But I'll try to get back to that at some point in the future and make it look slightly better. For now, I wanted to work on the south of the city, since this is really where some of the more unique parts are. Generally what I did to try and save time is that I'm not using ploppables as much as I normally would, as for instance in Oslo City. So with a lot of areas that just have a very similar look throughout the whole area, I just used zoning. So in the center of the city, I'm just zoning everything to residential, office and commercial to get the standard European block buildings. But there are just some parts where there are some kind of unique buildings or unique setups with certain types of buildings that I decided to make everything ploppable. And this is one of those parts. There's just a bunch of separate buildings over here that wouldn't really look good whatsoever if I did it with regular zoning and just got some other buildings in that way. So I decided to do everything with ploppables over here, which ends up taking a little bit more time, and it's definitely one of the reasons why this whole project ended up taking more time than I expected, because in the beginning, when I was sort of giving my estimates for how long this whole project would take, I was basically just figuring that I could do most of the areas with just zoning, but plopping down just single buildings just to make sure that they've got a very realistic look compared to how it looks in real life is one of the most time-consuming things in this project. Especially around this area, there's also the castle of Oslo, which is really nice. It is actually quite nice, but it's something which, for one, there isn't any asset for, so making that look like Oslo castle proper is going to be really difficult. And a second problem is that it's kind of located on a hill in a very difficult layout. So that's also something that I was procrastinating on at the time when I was recording this. I kind of just wanted to finish the rest of the city center and then move into the more difficult bits. But I will get into the castle at some point. At least there are some castle walls in this game, which, even though they aren't perfect, at least kind of get a very similar look. So I'll definitely get into the castle at some point in the future. And now over here is the area right in front of the city hall. Another one of those buildings which is very much a signature building, but which I don't really have access to. So for the time being, I think I'm procrastinating on it at this point as well. But at some point I just plopped in some apartment buildings that kind of had a very similar shape. So yeah, nothing is gonna quite look the way that it does in real life. Just trying to make it look as similar as I can. This whole area turned out to be a little bit more difficult than I expected. It's one of those areas where if you look at Oslo on Google Maps from an aerial perspective, it looks easy enough. But that's when you don't realize that everything is kind of on different planes. The city is super compact, and it has lots of tunnels and parts where you're either on a higher elevation or a lower elevation, and this is definitely one of those areas. We've got some highway tunnels underneath here which need some connections to the roads on ground level. There are some roads which kind of intersect on different heights. It's like this part is built on a hill, but everything is still kind of horizontal until you hit a certain wall, and the whole ground level just kind of goes up one floor. And yeah, some city districts are just a little bit complicated that way. Then again, I think that's definitely what makes Oslo very interesting. There are not a lot of cities that have this very natural kind of way of not being able to expand outward very much, since the hills of Oslo are protected as a nature area. The city kinda has to build on itself in a way and try to become more dense rather than sprawl out toward its surroundings. And I think you get some interesting results from that kind of natural handicap that the city has. Besides, at the same time, it's something which helps the city be really sustainable in a way, since much of the power actually comes from hydroelectric dams and that kind of thing. So that's one of the reasons why I believe Norway is definitely one of the greenest cities in Europe, if not the world. Now, in this last part of the video, I wanted to get to the surroundings of the royal palace, and there's some really difficult footage to look at here, since I'm just trying to copy these buildings by placing similar looking buildings, placing a palace in Potsdam in Germany, just because it's just about the most similar and modular building that I've been able to find. So everything looks quite different. At least the parks is something that is reasonably doable, to just kind of copy over the layouts and then add all of the trees, etc. By the way, the trees is also one of those things where I wanted to not download too much, so I'm really just using a couple of trees throughout the city. So remember, it's not really gonna look all that good on a ground level. I just decided to go for these trees because they're quite detailed, and I think they have the right kind of color, which works out for the sort of boreal environment of the city. And I think it's one of the trees that looks best if you look at the city from an aerial perspective. So that's kind of the reasoning behind that. Ooh, and yeah, this area is also kind of complicated. For now, I should note that I actually did a slightly different thing with this underground tunnel highway than the real life situation is. In real life, the highway kind of stays underground. There's just an area where the roof is kind of open. So even though you can see the road from the sky, it's still like sunken into the ground. And in this case, I made it so that it actually comes up to the ground and has an intersection with the road. I might change that, but the problem is that in real life, the highway stays underground, but it's got like these retaining walls on the sides, and there's already buildings right next to it. So it's a really dense area in a way that's impossible to recreate in City Skylines, at least not without having all kinds of mods and assets to fix that up. So that's an area which isn't entirely as realistic as I'd hoped it'd be. In any case, that's it for this episode. I hope I wasn't complaining about everything too much. I just want to kind of keep the expectations down a little bit. These videos are really just something that I want to share to kind of get the creative process of how this is all made in video form and kind of share how I do this kind of thing. But at the same time, it's really not quite similar to other City Skylines projects on YouTube right now, in a sense that it's not so much about the way that the city looks, but really just that it functions as a real-life Oslo and that it's a believable copy. So I just want to kind of manage the expectations in that way. That said, next episode is going to be my favorite episode. It's the episode in which I finally get to the area of Økern, or the future Hovenbyen area, which is a part of the city with lots of highway tunnels and roundabouts and car retailers. I know that sounds kind of weird, but from an aerial perspective and from a game perspective, it's a super interesting area, and it's been the biggest challenge by far in recreating Oslo, since it's really complicated when it comes to the roadworks. So I'm definitely going to be happy to share that area in the next episode, but I'm afraid you're going to have to wait for the next episode to see that. So thanks for watching guys, and I hope to see you next time.